We're going to start in Acts chapter 22. We're actually going to start with verse 21, which is kind of a closing statement that Paul makes. If you were here last week, we talked about how Paul had been arrested in Jerusalem and given an opportunity to stand in front of a Jewish, we might call a mob, and be able to give his testimony again. And everything goes pretty well with that crowd until this verse 21, and there's one word in there that really just sets the crowd off, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but it's that last word of verse 21, that word Gentile, and there's some implications with that. We'll look at it as we get into our questions, but let's read together starting in verse 21, and Paul is reiterating what God had spoke to him when he was called to be the missionary, if you want to call him that, to the Gentile people. And so verse 21, Paul is saying, and he said to me, this is the Lord said to Paul, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. And verse 22, then up to this word they listened to him. Then they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live. Now, that's a pretty bold statement just because he said, God is sending me to the Gentiles. But that was their feeling. Verse 23, and as they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, the tribune ordered him to be brought into the barracks. Now this is the Roman tribune, saying that he should be examined by flogging to find out why they were shouting against him like this. But when they had stretched him out for the whips, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen and uncondemned? And when the centurion heard this, he went to the tribune and said to him, what are you about to do? For this man is a Roman citizen. So the tribune came and said to him, tell me, are you a Roman citizen? And he said, yes. The tribune answered, I bought this citizenship for a large sum. Paul said, but I am a citizen by birth. So those who were about to examine him withdrew from him immediately, and the tribune also was afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. But on the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he unbound him and commanded the chief priest and all the council to meet. And he brought Paul down and set him before them. And looking intently at the council, Paul said, brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law you order me to be struck? Those who stood by said, would you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Now when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out to the council, or in the council, brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. Then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' party stood up and contended sharply, we find nothing wrong in this man. What if a spirit or an angel spoke to him? And when the dissension became violent, the tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him away from among them by force and bring him into the barracks. And the following night the Lord stood by him and said, take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome. So let's back up and let's kind of pick up with that verse 21. And if you picked up the list of questions on your way in, first question is, Paul in verse 21 speaks of his call by Christ to go to the Gentiles. And this brings out anger in the Jews. What else does it show us about the Jews? So they become very angry to the point, if you look in verse 23, they were shouting, throwing off their cloaks and throwing dust in the air, which sounds like a childish move, really, but that's what they were doing. So what is it about the Jews that we see here other than they're very angry? It did. And their pride ran very deep because they considered themselves to be God's chosen people. And so to the Gentiles, we've had these conversations before on Wednesday night, but the Jews considered the Gentiles dogs in terms of did not value them as equals with themselves because, again, they were God's chosen people. But when we look at this, we also find in Old Testament there was a provision for Gentiles to become Jewish people. It meant they had to go through some purification type things in the temple, and there was a formal way for them to do that. But they could actually become Jewish, and there were some that did. So the Gentiles weren't absolutely against, I'm sorry, I said that backwards. The Jews were not absolutely against a Gentile, but the only way that the Jews believed that the Gentiles could be accepted by God was if they became a Jew. And that's key to this, because they're saying the only way for someone to be accepted by God would be for them to become Jewish. Now, do we have any record of an individual becoming a Jew that was a Gentile? It was a right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. Let's think Old Testament about it. You're right about Timothy though, because he wasn't. His mom was. His dad wasn't. What about the lineage of Christ? Yeah, Rahab. You remember Rahab, the one that saved the spies when they go in and they kind of look out over Jericho and they're trying to figure out what to do there, and Rahab takes them in. She's actually a prostitute, runs somewhat of a brothel, if you want to call it that. And the spies say, you know, if you'll put this red, I think it was a red or scarlet rope down, when we come and God destroys the city, you'll be spared, you and your family will be spared. Rahab actually becomes an Israelite. So this is that portion of the Old Testament law that she took advantage of, and apparently some of her family as well. But she actually is in the lineage of Christ that's recorded. So that's one that we know of, absolutely, that became. So when we think about what Paul says here in verse 21, now again, this was God speaking to him. But the statement is, "Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles." That statement was more than just Christ was sending him to go talk to the Gentiles. That statement was God was now opening the door for the Gentiles at the hands of Paul being the speaker, but Christ himself. Now this goes contrary to everything that the Old Testament Jew would hold valuable, because the only way was you have to become a Jew first. Then you can be accepted by God. But what Paul makes the statement here is Paul is reiterating to them that God told him, you're going to speak to the Gentiles so that the Gentiles can be accepted by God. Not so that they can become Jewish and be accepted by God, but so that they can be accepted by God through Christ, is that path. So they are angry, but they also believe that Paul's committed hypocrisy here as well, heresy that he spoke. So their anger is twofold, and their pride is, you have to be one of us to be able to be accepted by God. Now, this can play in today, if we're not careful, that we can take on sometimes some viewpoints of people have to look similar to or act in the way we act in order for God to accept them. If we're not careful, we develop that line of thought. And that's simply not the case. They have to look like Christ, not like us. And we have to keep that in mind. It is Christ that does the saving. We become more like Christ as we follow Him and as we become His disciple and learn more about Him and try to serve Him. But people should never become looking like us, because if we disciple them to look like us, we've just discipled them to be a sinner. We need to disciple them to look like Christ. And that's what they were missing at that point in time.
The original plan was for the Jews to be the light unto the Gentiles. But they just kind of reneged, never did accept that. They turned their back on that mission
Yeah.
and became even more separatist, elitist group of people.
Absolutely. And Eddie has walked all over the rest of my lesson already. So it's good to have Eddie here. Question 2, before Christ on earth, so before He walked on the face of the earth, could Gentiles be made right with God? Now, we kind of already talked about that. They could. There was a process that they were to go through, and technically they would become an Israelite at that point in time, but it was a way for them to actually be in good standing with God. We talked about it, how it was to happen. There was a provision in the law that allowed them, and there was sacrifices that had to be made and presented in the tabernacle or the temple, either one, depending on which time period. Question 3 then, what were the Jews supposed to be to the Gentiles? Brother Eddie, just go ahead and say it. No light. No light. What was Paul suggesting about the Gentiles? How was Paul suggesting that the Gentiles could be made right with God? So they were supposed to be the light that showed them God, not showed them a bunch of laws. And they got that really mixed up, and then they felt that they were the only ones at one point in time. And when we say this, please understand, not every single Jew felt that way. We're generalizing when we say this, but it was the overall thought, especially of the religious leaders at that point. Paul's suggestion about the Gentiles was really from Christ, and Paul was just following through with what God wanted him to do, and that was to go make available the message of, we call it the gospel, to all people, and so that all people would have the avenue to become right with God again, because that's been God's desire from the time of the fall, was for man to be reconciled back to Him. God's desire was not, after the fall, that man stay at a distance from God. He wanted reconciliation. And so he makes the path, but He also points ahead through everything He does Old Testament, points ahead to the Messiah that would come. And as the Messiah comes then, Paul is one of the individuals that's charged with going and making sure that all peoples know about this. Paul was suggesting that the Gentiles were made right with God through Christ, and this was a huge issue for the Jewish people because they, number one, didn't accept Jesus as Christ, the Messiah. So that was the biggest issue. But secondly, beyond that was the law gives us the way that people can be reconciled to God. The law never reconciled anyone to God. It rolled their sins forward every year until the Messiah would come, but then they wouldn't accept Him when He came. So it never reconciled them. It gave them the path to roll sin forward so that one day it would be forgiven, and that's through Christ, obviously. Question 4 then, why was the Roman official going to have Paul beaten? he had just given Paul the opportunity to speak to the people. What made him change his mind about how to treat Paul? So this has to go back a little bit into chapter 22 a little bit, because we talked about it, but Paul had been arrested. If you remember, he had went into the temple. Jewish people started beating him up and were intending to beat him to death. And then the Romans find out about it, so they send soldiers down. They arrest Paul, which actually saves his life. And then on his way into being put in prison, he asks, "Can I speak to this crowd?" And the Roman official says, "Sure." And so he's kind of on this second story portico. The crowd's kind of out below him. And he speaks to them, and he gives his personal testimony, actually. And everything goes well until that last verse that we looked at, verse 21, where he says that God sent him far away to the Gentiles. So the Roman official had granted him permission to speak to this group. But then something changes. Once the crowd becomes incited again, the Roman official pulls Paul back in, and he says, "Okay, stretch him out. We're going to flog him." Which, by the way, was the same, going by original language, it was the same beating that Christ would have taken or did take before his crucifixion. So that's what Paul was about to endure. Why does the Roman official change his mind? Because Paul seems to find some favor with him by him allowing him to go speak, but then all of a sudden that's gone. So what's he trying to accomplish here? Okay, so he doesn't want the uprising, obviously, because that's a threat then to him, because if Rome finds out about it, they're going to remove him from power, so it's a power play as well. What's he trying to find out, though? Or is he trying to find out? Yeah. He still thought there was something. Paul had done something. And so he's trying to find this out. And so in Roman world, we beat someone until they tell us the answer. I started to say it's kind of like with your kid. You don't do that with your kid, right? You don't beat them until they give you the answer. But maybe you wanted to sometimes, but you don't do that. You're not supposed to do that. But that was the Roman world. He won't give us the answer, so we're going to beat him until he does, because there's something there. Now, the real issue is there's not an issue, because Paul hasn't done anything other than what he's already said. So,
Subject of the Roman government either.
Correct, yeah. That Roman citizenship was extremely valuable. And Paul, of course, we read it, Paul appeals to that, but the guy is trying to find out something that's not there. He could have beat Paul for 2 days, and he never would have got the answer, because there wasn't anything else. Paul had told him everything. So he changes his mind because he feels like there's something he doesn't know, but he actually knows everything. And so we find that, let's just look at question 5. From verse 30 then, how did God use the Roman official in a way that gave Paul an opportunity to witness about Jesus? So, Paul says what he says down through 21. Crowd gets incited. They arrest him again, or bring him in, and they're about to beat him. He appeals to the citizenship. Then we find in verse 30, the next day, this guy is still wanting to know the real reason. Look at verse 30. The next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he unbound him and commanded the chief priest and all the council to meet. By the way, this was not customary for a Roman citizen or Roman official to call the council together. This is a Jewish council. So this is the Pharisees and Sadducees, a ruling religious body. It's not customary for the Roman official to do that, but he does. And so they bring Paul and they set him in front of him. Now think about this opportunity, because it is an opportunity. Now let's go back, though, into chapter 21 and 20. There were at least three groups of people that when Paul told them he was going to go to Jerusalem, he was going to be arrested and he was going to be bound, there were at least three groups of people that said, Paul, you don't need to go. Don't go. We're not going to see you again. We don't want you to go there. Now let's think about what we've read so far. Paul goes into the temple. The Jewish people are about to beat him to death. Romans come and arrest him, which actually saves his life, right? Then we find that he gets to speak in front of the mob. The mob gets incited again, so he gets arrested and he's about to be flogged, and he appeals this Roman citizenship, and so he finds favor with the Roman tribune or the Roman official at that point. But then the next day, the Roman guy says, we got to get to the bottom of this. So let's bring the Pharisees and Sadducees in, and Paul, I want you to stand in front of them, and you're going to stand trial there. Well, this is a perfect opportunity, because Paul now gets to speak to the religious leaders without the whole mob there. And Paul, hopefully, in his mind, you got to believe, Paul's thinking, I get to speak about Christ one more time to these guys. So not only did his arrest save his life a couple of times, but his arrest now has given him the opportunity to speak to the Jewish religious leaders, which Paul would have never had the opportunity to walk in and do. He would have been kicked out before he ever got there. So this Roman official had no idea, but God was using him in a way to actually share the gospel with the people that needed to hear it just as much as anyone else, and that's the Jewish religious leaders. God's ways are way above ours, and we don't see it at the moment in the time. But yet God is working things that we can never imagine in the moment that we live. And when we get down the road somewhere, months, years, maybe long way down the road, we can look back sometimes and we see exactly what God was doing. But in the moment, we don't. So it's where this faith comes in, of trusting Him, even in the times when we don't understand. So question 6 then, what truth did Paul state in chapter 23, verse 1? This is an interesting statement he makes. And then the last part of that question is, what was Paul's question to them by stating this? So chapter 23, verse 1, Paul is standing in front of the Jewish council. So Pharisees, Sadducees, and high priest is standing there. And he makes this statement, brothers, I've lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. Now, I think we've talked a few times about terminology to Paul was really important because it was his way of connecting or not connecting. And so the first word he uses is brothers. He's trying to connect himself. And if you go back into chapter 22 where he gave his testimony, he basically had said, I was one of you. I was trained by the best trainers. I'd done the same things you guys have done. He tried to connect there. So now he's with the religious leaders, not the mob, but the religious leaders. And he's calling them brothers, an enduring term, trying to make a connection with them. But then notice the statement, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. Now, what's their response to that? Ananias says, slap him, right? This is like when you say something to your mama you're not supposed to say. Slaps him. All he said was, up to this point, I've lived my life in good conscience before God. Why was that such a hard statement? What was he actually asking by making that statement? He's saying, guys, brothers, I've lived good conscience before God. Now, it's not recorded here for us, but the implication is, what about you? Now, that strikes home, right? Doesn't matter if you call me brother or cousin or nephew or whatever you call me, you're asking me, this is what Paul was doing, have you lived your life in good conscience before God? That's why the high priest said, slap the guy. Because he's now questioned the high priest. Now, there is some question here, did Paul know he was the high priest or not? It seems that he did not know, which this seems odd because the high priest always dressed in a certain way, which designated him as the high priest. So Paul would have known what that dress looked like. The answer to that possibly is the Roman official called this group together, and it seems to be maybe without much notice, which may have meant that the high priest did not get dressed in his traditional garments that he wore. And therefore, Paul would not have recognized him as a high priest. Remember, Paul's not been in Jerusalem for a period of time, so he would not have been in front of him at that point. So there's a little bit of question there about that. But once Paul is told this is the high priest, he actually says, shouldn't have said what I said. But he had said it, and it was really truth. And so question 7 is, what did Paul mean by the statement, you whitewashed wall?
You may have lipstick on, but you're still a pig.
Yeah, that's true. Every time I read this, I think back to some of the TV shows in the era, kind of the Leave It to Beaver time frame, and inevitably in one of those shows, somewhere along the way, you would see their house, and they would have this white picket fence around it. Y'all remember that? Seen some of those? And inevitably, somewhere in there would be a kid or someone that in one of the episodes would be painting or whitewashing, they called it, the fence. Do y'all remember that? What's interesting is, and you know this, they don't necessarily show it in the show, but I always think about this when I see that. That fence, they would paint over it with white to make it look really good. But underneath that white, at some point, that wood rotted and it turned bad. And it didn't matter how much white paint you put on it, eventually it showed through that it was rotten wood at some point. They didn't show that in the TV show, but we know that to be true, right? It's a similar case here. No matter how much lipstick you put on the pig, it's still a pig. And no matter how much white paint you put on, you still got problems underneath. And Paul is saying, y'all got problems underneath. And I don't care what you look like outwardly, you still got problems. And the only way those problems were going to be addressed is if they would accept Jesus as the Christ, the Messiah. And because they wouldn't accept that, it didn't matter what else they'd done, because now was the time for the Messiah to be accepted. Just as today is the time for us, for the Messiah to be accepted if you have not. And it doesn't matter what we do, and we hear these statements made by people a lot of times that before they can go to church, there's some things they got to get right or get better or do differently in their life. And that is nothing more than Satan convincing us of a lie, because we can never do enough to make the inside look well enough to come. It is only through Christ that the inside gets made well. And it's when Christ begins living inside, and that's when things change. And that's when we're no longer whitewashed, we're white through and through. Doesn't mean we don't sin, I'm not saying that. But we've been changed from the inside out. The wood's not rotten inside with white paint over it. The inside becomes good, and it begins to show on the outside. And it starts whitening up by our actions that we live out daily. So Paul calls them this whitewashed wall. Question 8 then, Paul identifies himself as a Pharisee and then states he's on trial because his hope is in the resurrection of the dead. Why would he say this? Again, you got two different groups of people there. Pharisees, Sadducees. What do the Pharisees believe in? resurrection, they believe in angels, they believe in the Spirit. What does the Sadducees believe in? Yeah, that's the easiest way to say it. None of that. They believed in the first 4 books of the Old Testament, and the rest of them they did not listen to or pay attention to. So none of the prophets. So Paul recognizes there's 2 different groups of people here. Now, Paul was a Pharisee. That was his upbringing. So he did believe in the resurrection. But Paul also knew that this was his opportunity with these 2 groups of people there to try and speak to them about the resurrection. Now, some have theorized that Paul, knowing that there was the 2 different groups of people, that if he brings up this resurrection, it's going to create dissension, and that's going to get him out of this bad situation that he's in. I struggle with that because I think Paul always was looking to present the gospel. He was looking to present Christ. He wanted people to believe in Christ. I don't believe that Paul would have created a distraction just to get out of the situation, because I think Paul was happy to stand in front of this group of people and try to get them to understand Jesus Christ. So I struggle with that. Some believe that that's what he done. I don't know if it is or not. But we do find the end result is that these 2 groups become very angry with each other. Now, these groups were together on multiple occasions. This was not the first time. This was a council that did come together. So somehow in the past they had got along, and the way they got along was they just never talked about these things. So this is kind of, I tried to think this morning in class, I tried to think an example, and the closest thing I could kind of come to is within our state we have some Free Will Baptist churches that believe that the only Bible translation that you should use is King James Version, which is not a bad translation. We know that. But there are other churches that believe that there are good translations, such as ESV, New King James, NIV, others that you can use, and they try to hold true to the Scripture as well, and that they're okay to use. We believe that you can use more than just King James. Within some associations within the state, both of those churches exist. One that believes only King James, and one that believes you can use others. They exist in the same association, but you know what they never talk about when they come together? Version of the Bible. Yeah, they never talk about it. And because of that, they exist together. The Pharisees and Sadducees could come together and they could have a council together as long as they didn't talk about angels, the Spirit, or resurrection. But when they talked about those things, this is what happened, because they couldn't agree on it. And so when Paul brings it up, and I think Paul is trying to talk to them about the resurrection because he knows through Christ there is a resurrection. So why would he not talk to them about it? Because if he doesn't talk about it, he's not speaking full truth. And so he speaks full truth, which happens then to upset the Sadducees because they don't believe in that. And so you have this dissension, and actually it's interesting, the word they use, a great clamor arose. We don't use that word much anymore. But there was a great problem that existed at that point in time. And again, Paul is, you might say, arrested or bound. They bring him back into the barracks. Again, another sign of, like, he's arrested, but it's actually for his own good, because Pharisees and Sadducees were actually going to tear him apart if this didn't happen. So again, we find God using that in a good way. Question 9, did the Roman official accomplish what he set out to accomplish? Not really. The only thing he found out was that these people can't get along, which is sad because they were viewed as God's people, right? We have to think about that today. Because sometimes, and if we're not careful, I think we spoke a little bit about this Sunday night, if we're not careful, sometimes it's a whole lot easier for us to find things to disagree on than it is to agree on. And when the world sees God, what's supposed to be God's people, in great disagreement with each other, we're really not accomplishing anything in the world. So we have to work at agreeing. We have to work at finding the things that we do agree on. And we have to focus, again, that comes back to focusing on Christ, because that is what unites us together. And that is our agreeing point, is that Christ is the Son of God. So he really didn't accomplish what he set out to, other than he found out they can't get along. Question 10, what was Paul's goal in speaking to the Pharisees and Sadducees? Again, personally, this is me personally, but I think he wanted to actually share Christ one more time with this Jewish leaders, because if he could get the leaders, the people would follow, but getting those leaders. So I think it was in his heart. He knew shortly, he knows he's going to Rome, and he had been told that he wouldn't see these people again, so I think he was taking advantage of the opportunity. Was Paul's arrest a good thing? We've talked about this multiple times. Yeah, it was, but it didn't look that way. And neither do our difficult situations sometimes look good, but many times they are. Now, I'm not talking about the difficult ones that we create. I'm talking about the difficult ones that for some reason God allows to come into our life. Not the foolish decisions we make that cause us to be in bad situations, but I'm talking about the ones that happen just out of nowhere, that catch us off guard. We did nothing to cause it. It just happened, and God's allowed it for some reason. Question 12 then. What encouragement could Paul take from verse 11? So let's look at verse 11 of chapter 23, the last verse we read. Following night, the Lord stood by him and said, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome." What courage can Paul take from this statement? He's actually told to be encouraged, right? Christ tells him. He knows he's not going to die in Jerusalem. He's got some more days ahead of him, right? What else? You're absolutely right, yeah. What else? Doing God's will, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting if you want to kind of take this and divide Paul's life into two different segments here, and there's probably more segments than two, but if we want to look at two different segments at this point, notice what Christ says to him. Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome. This is almost, we don't create checklists in our life with Christ. Please understand that. But if you want to think about that for just a moment, if Paul would have known there's two things in life that I've got to do, one of them is to testify in Jerusalem, the other is to testify in Rome. Paul could now check off, God has told me I have been faithful to testify in Jerusalem. This is when you think about courage, you can look at it from the standpoint of, okay, I'm not about to die here in Jerusalem because I'm going to go. Maybe that's encouragement. I've got some more days here on this earth. You can also think about it from courage that God's telling me I have done what He wanted me to do. And isn't it good sometimes for us to be able to hear that we've actually fulfilled something we were supposed to do? If you can think back to maybe when you were a child under your parents' roof house, and your parents asked you to do something and you did it, and they kind of came along beside you and they patted you on the back and said, "Good job. You done what I wanted you to do." Maybe they told you to go clean your room. You wasn't very good at doing it, and you went and done it, and they kind of pat you on the back and say, "Good job." It kind of feels good to hear that every once in a while, right? And it's a little bit of encouragement to continue on. So maybe there's some courage there that Paul now knows, okay, this portion of what God wanted me to do, I've done. Now, I want to take you back to Acts chapter 1, verse 8. You remember this verse, right? You will be my witnesses where? Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and uttermost parts of the earth. All right, where is he? Jerusalem. Check mark. I'm going to be his witness there. Now, what about this uttermost parts of the earth? Where is that? Yeah, except in Roman days, when Rome was the ruling power, if you could get to Rome, everything went through Rome. So if you get to Rome and you testify in Rome, there's a really good chance that it's going to go to the rest of the world. This is almost the bookmark ends, if you want to think about it that way, of testify in Jerusalem, testify uttermost parts of the earth. God's brought you in this roundabout 3 different missionary trip journeys back to Jerusalem now, and you've testified there in front of even the religious leaders, Pharisees and Sadducees now. And now God's saying, you've been faithful to do this. I'm going to take you to the uttermost parts of the earth, theoretically, Rome, and you're going to testify here as well. It's interesting how God works and His plan that we don't get to see and Paul didn't get to see, but it starts becoming clearer the more we follow Him and the more we pay attention to what He's doing in our life. What I want to present to you tonight is, and I don't know if you want to bookmark your life, bookend your life or not, but you probably all have a Jerusalem and you probably all have a Rome, and you haven't got to Rome yet. You may be in the midst of your Jerusalem, to where God's calling you to actually minister, teach, disciple, lead, whatever it may be. God's calling you in this Jerusalem area of yours to be faithful and be His witness and testify for Him. Maybe you've completed that portion of it. I don't know. Maybe you're in the process of going to Rome. We remember that it was in Rome that Paul's life came to an end, right?
That's what I was going to say. You're not done spreading the gospel until God calls you home.
We're not done until Rome's over, to put it in terms of Paul. So we can't quit. Could you imagine if Paul would have said, man, I'm grateful that I was faithful to testify in Jerusalem, so I got that behind me. I'm going to sit down for a little while. Wasn't God's plan. And I don't think it's His plan for any of us either. Now, does it look differently at times? Absolutely. You look at Paul's life, and this is, I don't know if you call it a dividing point or not. Maybe it is. Somewhere in here would be somewhat of a dividing point. Paul's ministry life from this point forward looks quite a bit different than it did in his first 3 missionary journeys that we've just kind of wrapped up. He's about to begin this journey to Rome, and he embarks on some pretty detrimental things that happen in his life. Shipwrecks, he gets bit by a viper, he gets elevated to be like this God by these people that see him get bitten by a viper, and he has to tell them, quit it, that's not who I am. All of these different struggles for him to get to Rome. It's somewhat different. He has struggles before, so I'm not saying he didn't have them. But it's a little bit a different life as he makes his way toward Rome. You have different portions of life. There's parts of life that you go through that's easier than others, parts of life you go through that maybe is more challenging than others. And then you find yourself at this spot, and God's call is still the same, to be His witness and to testify. Notice that. God doesn't say in verse 11 to Paul, you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so now you're just going to become someone that takes care of children for the rest of your life. That's not what He says. He says, you're going to continue testifying. The location's just going to be different. Which then goes back again to that Acts 1:8 passage. Or if we go back to Matthew 28:18 through 20, Great Commission, and we find that God's call for us never changes. The location may change, the method may change, but the call never changes. What encouragement does Paul take from verse 11? He's got days ahead of him. He's got a new place that he's going to go minister in. He's got encouragement that I've been faithful to do what God called me to do before. I just need to stay on this same path to continue to do it going forward. And for us, when we look at what Paul sees here, we have to take courage too that God has a Rome for us. And we hadn't made it there yet. And we got to be faithful to complete our Rome, no matter what that looks like. Now, you can break that down into individually. You can also break that down into the life of a church. You can say, you know, maybe as a church, we've testified faithfully in Jerusalem, but now it's time for us to testify faithfully in Rome. And you say, well, how do you do that as a church? Well, maybe it's different avenues that you reach the same community, but it's Rome now instead of Jerusalem. Or maybe it's you reach different areas or different places. I don't know what it is. God does. We just got to be faithful to follow Him wherever it may be. But be encouraged. As Paul had went through this time, and you got to wonder, because Paul was human. We can't lose sight of that. He was a human being. Paul had moments when he would be imprisoned in Rome where he struggled, mentally struggled. He makes statements such as, everyone has deserted me. Please bring me my cloak. Bring me the scrolls. Things that he felt he had to have. Paul went through physical struggles when he goes to Rome. Somewhat different than what he went through as he was in this Jerusalem time frame of his life. And we'll go through different ones too. But we still have to remain faithful to testify about Him. Not about us, but about Him. The resurrection. The way of salvation through Jesus Christ. I want to encourage you. Ask God what your Rome is. Maybe it's been a while since you've asked Him. Where is my Rome? Where is my place that you want me to be working, testifying, witnessing? It may be right where you are. It may be that God's got a door open you hadn't even seen yet, and He's just waiting for you to ask. But be faithful to complete your Rome. Don't sit down and get happy with Jerusalem. Be faithful to complete Rome.
Even in our culture today, we still use the idiom, all roads lead to Rome.
That's right. That's right.
That's usually not applied in a spiritual way, but it surely can be.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. Any other thoughts or questions, comments tonight?
I think it's interesting that once he, you know, he came against, even other believers, not against, but they were saying, don't go to Jerusalem, you know. And so he said, you know, the Lord's will be done, and he went. And then God comes and says, okay, you've done this. Now Rome is the next thing on my agenda for you. But God didn't tell him before he went,
That's right.
you're going to go to Jerusalem, then you're going to go to Rome. No, it's be obedient here, and then he gets the commission of what he's going to do next.
Yeah.
And I think about the book that we read in Deidre, the Red Sea Rules, how when you don't know what to do, just take the next logical step in faith.
Absolutely.
And God will, you know, he's going to show you.
Absolutely. That's a great point. And I'm glad you said that because I've actually been meaning to make this statement since the first Sunday in January. And I keep forgetting it every week. Anita said, when you don't know what to do, take the next step, which is Rob Morgan is the author of Red Sea Rules. If you hadn't read the book, it's a great book to read based on the Israelites crossing the Red Sea and just some principles that they used in that, or you find in that. Just thinking about your spiritual life, and this goes well with what we're talking about here with Rome. You may be at a certain place in your spiritual walk, maybe a certain place in your activity in church or in the community and far as discipling others or reaching out to others. I would encourage you in this year, as you think about going forward, to take whatever the next step is in your discipleship walk. And I don't know what that is for you, but maybe God's been talking to you about that. Now, it may not be Rome, right? It may be on the way to Rome. But take that next step. Because if we never take the next step, then we never get to Rome. So think about where you are in your walk with Christ and think about what that next step might be. And then think about doing that as you go forward throughout this year. And then when you get to that step, think about the next one. And ultimately, you'll end up at Rome and you'll hear the words, not just what Paul hears here, but you'll hear the words, "Well done, thy good and faithful servant." That's what we desire to hear. Right? Let's pray together. Dear Heavenly Father, we come to you today, Lord, thanking you for this time that you have given us here. And Lord, thank you for your words, the examples we see, what you recorded for us that is so relevant today to our life. And I just pray, Lord, that we would be able to make this, that we would open our hearts enough to allow you to let this apply to us as we live our life even tomorrow, and maybe even on our way home tonight. So, Lord, I pray that we don't just realize that Paul was a guy in history, but we realize that Paul was living principles that we need to know today. So, Lord, help us to live out our Jerusalem and live out our Rome. Lord, I pray as a church that we would do that as well as we minister in a community or an area, a region, or around the world. Lord, just help us to be faithful, and Lord, ultimately so that others might hear about you and you might be glorified, and Lord, your name might be lifted high, not ours, not the church's, but yours. I thank you for your goodness to us. You've blessed us in so many ways, as individuals, as people. I pray that we remember to give thanks to you each time in each way. I pray this all in your Son's name, Jesus the Christ. Amen.